Sony's new 50 to 150 millimeter f2 G Master has created a lot of buzz for being the first full frame zoom to reach 150 millimeters with that constant maximum aperture of f2. But Tamron was the first genre boosting zoom like this back in 2021, where they coupled a bigger zoom ratio from 35 to 150 millimeters with a still fast variable maximum aperture of f2 to f2.8. Now, obviously, both of these lenses are kind of unique on E-mount in that there are very few other alternatives that are quite like them. Sigma does have a 28 to 105 millimeter f2.8. However, that lens is not as fast and certainly doesn't go as long. And so in many ways, these are the closest to competitors in this particular space. So the question is this new G Master lens worth twice as much as the existing Tamron lens that's been on the market for a while? Well, this is another one of our head-to-head videos, and we're going to jump in and we are going to find out today. So the Sony is a loaner from Sony USA, and we'll be going back to them after this review. The Tamron is my own personal copy that I bought back in 2021. We're going to start by taking a look at the similarities between the two lenses, because although they look pretty radically different, there are some commonalities that I think are worth exploring. Both of them have a thorough weather sealing, and you might argue that, well, the G Master is probably the better sealed. Perhaps that's true, but they both have the same ingredients here. They both have a gasket at the lens mount, a fluorine coating at the front element, and then seals at all of the various rings and buttons inside. So they all have those similar kind of capabilities. They both have three of the function buttons that are placed at three different locations around, and so that you have the opportunity to have one near at hand. Both of them have the ability to do a smooth aperture rack. And as you can see here, the Tamron does a good job with that. And of course, the premium G Master lens also does a very good job with that. And so I don't know that I really saw a difference. I do prefer the G Master's setup for that, and we'll get to that in a moment. But in terms of doing aperture racks, you can do that just as easily on the Tamron as you can on the G Master. Both of them share a common flaw in that they both have issues with flare, particularly on the telephoto end. But even on the wide end, they do struggle a bit in certain situations with having particularly ghosting artifacts, and on the telephoto end, more likely to have a little bit of a loss of contrast. And so, unfortunately, they both share a weakness in that regard. Now, in the category of neutral differences, areas where they're different, but not with any kind of particular benefit one way or another, you could argue either direction. One of them is very obviously has the white finish, the other has a black finish. There are people who prefer the white finish. There are people that prefer the black finish. And it really comes down to a matter of preference. I don't actually think that in any kind of clinical way one is better than the other, but obviously it is a difference. So we're going to look at some reasons to choose the Tamron. It's been on the market now for quite a while, and so it's a well-known commodity, particularly to myself, because this has been the lens that I have used probably more than any other over the last 4 years. And so we're going to look at it first and some reasons to choose it. The first of those is a practical reason. It is much, much cheaper, and I mean much cheaper. Right now you can get it for about $1,700 as of today's pricing on B&H Photo. The new Sony is a pre-order at $3,898. And so if you're doing the math, that means that there's about $2,200 difference between the two lenses. You could buy two of the Tamron lenses and still have a pretty fair chunk of change left over to buy something else before you could pay for the G Master. That's a practical consideration for a lot of people. Furthermore, the Tamron has a bigger zoom range. It starts at 35 rather than 50 millimeters, and as I zoom in and out here, you can see you have the ability to go considerably wider than what you have. And I will say also, in lining things up at around 50 millimeters. And so let's just say that the Tamron at 50 millimeters is wider than what the Sony is at 50 millimeters. As you can pretty obviously see, the Tamron is much smaller. It is 89.2 millimeters in diameter by 158 millimeters in length. Meanwhile, you can tell even from the front diameter, 102.8 8 millimeters for the Sony lens. That is a significant difference in diameter, and it is 200 millimeters long. And so that's about 32% less lens volume in the Tamron. Now, to be fair, the Tamron is an externally zooming lens, so when you zoom it out, it's not really any shorter, but the difference is, of course, for travel, for packing, it's a much easier lens to pack along because it is much smaller in its retracted state. It is also considerably lighter. It weighs in at 1,165 grams, whereas the Sony is 1,340 grams. Not terrible for what the Sony is, however, the Tamron is considerably lighter. If you're going to need to buy filters, it's going to be much cheaper to buy them for the Tamron, which has an 82 millimeter front filter thread. That is a pretty common filter size, and there's a lot of filters that come in that particular size, whereas here on the Sony, we're jumping up to a 95 millimeter front filter thread. So not only are filters going to be less common at 95 millimeters, they are going to be more expensive as well. Interestingly, I actually found in a lot of different tests that the Tamron is the one that has the lower levels of fringing. The Sony isn't bad, but in head-to-head comparisons, I certainly found that the Tamron was even better corrected in that regard. I also found that the Tamron produced more consistently round, call them bokeh balls, specular highlights across the frame. And the Sony is very good at maintaining a circular aperture as the aperture is stopped down. However, it does exhibit far more clipping near the edges of the frame, and some of that clipping is not overly organic looking. It's a little bit harsher, kind of more of a straight line, whereas the Tamron does a little bit better job maintaining those specular highlights. I also found in doing head-to-head shots, and I'll tell you this as you'll see in the optical breakdown at the end, there's some give and take in this, but particularly at the 150 millimeter end, I found that the Tamron's overall rendering was nicer to my eye. There's just something about the defocused areas that are more pleasing than what I saw out of the Sony lens. I also found that in head-to-head comparisons, I actually preferred the Tamron's colors to the Sony, and I feel like the Tamron has a little bit more of an organic look to it, while the Sony is just a little bit more clinical. Don't blow that out of proportion. It's a minor variance, but I did just kind of instinctively in head-to-head shots, I instinctively preferred what I saw out of the Tamron. So there are definitely some very valid reasons to choose the Tamron over the Sony. But of course you can flip that around, and there are a lot of equally valid reasons to choose the Sony over the Tamron. The first of those is a faster maximum aperture. Remember that the Tamron, while it starts at f2, it is a variable aperture zoom. And the truth of the matter is that by the time you get to 50 millimeters, where the Sony starts in its focal length, the Tamron has closed to f2.2. By the time you get to 85 millimeters, it is already at its smallest maximum aperture of f2.8, which means that over a fair portion of the zoom range, the Sony is going to be a full stop faster than what the Tamron is. And that has all kinds of implications: shallow depth of field, light gathering potential, etc., etc. Not as significant of a difference, but there is a little bit higher level of magnification on the Sony lens than what there is on the Tamron. The Tamron has a 0.18 times magnification. The Sony has a 0.20 times magnification. And so no, that's not a huge difference, and neither one of these lenses are going to be mistaken for a macro lens, but the Sony does a little bit better in that regard. Now, while I noted that you could do just as good of aperture racking on the Tamron lens, the truth of the matter is that the Tamron, it kind of has a backwards way of going about giving you aperture control if you want to control it that way. What it does is it gives you a custom switch that allows you to change the manual focus ring into an aperture ring. So it means it's always going to be declicked because it's just a constantly moving ring. The damping feels fine, nothing wrong with that overall. However, I have found that I actually don't love the aperture control through this. I end up doing a lot of times just controlling aperture from within the camera, because I find that it just moves way too quickly, and so you don't have as precise control as what you would like. The G Master has Sony's full G Master approach to aperture, or traditional aperture ring. You can either click or declick. It's got an iris lock. It's just got a whole lot better implementation of aperture control. I would also say that while both of these lenses are very nicely built, The Sony is next level. I mean, it does have a build quality that in many ways kind of suggests they're high-end super telephoto lenses. And so it's a little bit better constructed, a little bit more feature-rich. Now, to the Tamron's credit, it also has a nice metal body. I've had a copy that I've been using for years and it's held up very well. I have zero complaints about it. However, in just the overall feel of the lenses, I would say that the Sony is the more premium of the two. One big advantage when you're in the field is that it is an internally zooming lens. And we've already seen that the Tamron is an externally zooming lens, but it just means that you're going to be able to do things like zooming during video, for example. You can do that more smoothly here. You can make more quick changes. It means that there's far less likelihood of ever sucking in any kind of dust into the lens because it's much easier to seal overall. I mean, so far, I think the Tamron's actually done well. I can't really see dust inside my copy. However, there's just definite advantages to having that internally zooming design. The Sony does have a tripod foot, whereas the Tamron does not. I have found that the Tamron, while it's heavy, it's not so heavy that I feel like I definitively needed a tripod collar or foot on it, but obviously that is better implemented into the Sony design. And so it definitely, with this lens, I feel like it's going to balance better and perform better if you're using the tripod foot. And so that certainly is an advantage there. Less of a big deal because they both keep a good circular shape, but I did find that there are 11 blades on the Sony lens, there are 9 blades on the Tamron lens, and so it just means that it is a little bit better in terms of keeping that circular shape as you stop it down. Now, there is a more significant advantage for the Sony lens when it comes to the autofocus capabilities. This is, I mean, for a fast lens like this is as good as what I've seen. It's got quad XD linear motors, and so autofocus is pretty much instantaneous. There is a single VXD motor in the Tamron, and while it's a similar type motor and it does focus quickly, it isn't at the level of the Sony, and the Sony can track just effortlessly. It picks up from the very first frame, and on my Alpha 1, for example, it was just flawless in tracking across the frame. Very, very impressive in that regard. On the video side of things, I also found that there is less focus breathing. Actually, the Tamron is better than what I expected in this regard, but the Sony is both natively better, and then it also has the advantage of Sony's focus breathing compensation that only works for Sony lenses, and so any kind of breathing that was there, you can just mathematically eliminate through those algorithms, and the Tamron doesn't have that advantage. Also, you're going to find that f2 aperture means that there are plenty of situations where you can create a more shallow depth of field. And again, it's a fairly significant difference at f2.8. And so that just means that backgrounds are going to be more out of focus. There's a little bit more separation of your subject from the background. In my optical test, I found that while both of these lenses are extremely sharp and extremely high contrast, the Sony is more consistently so. And I found that in a lot of shots, particularly in my chart test, that there were just areas where the Sony sharpness was more consistent across the frame. It's definitely sharper in the corners almost all the time. And so it has some definite optical advantages in terms of sharpness. It also typically has better contrast relative to the Tamron when it comes to head-to-head comparisons. Now, that higher contrast may be part of why I like the defocused backgrounds a little bit better on the Tamron. Sometimes a higher contrast lens, there's a trade-off when it comes in that regard. But anyway, there's definitely better contrast if that's a priority for you. And then, of course, there are a number of baked-in Sony perks that are really important here. Unfortunately, the use of teleconverters is not one of those things, so I will give another dig over that. But you can unlock the full burst potential of your camera. So even if you're shooting on an A9 Mark III, you can shoot all the way up to 120 frames per second. You put this Tamron lens on the same camera and you're going to be capped at 15 frames per second because that is going to be the cap across all of Sony's camera bodies. And so it just means that if you're happy to use the lens for sports, this is going to be a more obvious choice because you're going to get that full potential from it. So my conclusion is this: while there are similarities between these two lenses, there's also a lot of differences. And I would say that if you are a portrait shooter or even a basic event shooter and you already own the Tamron lens, I still think that the Tamron is perfectly adequate for that. However, if you are someone who shoots sports, particularly court sports or, smaller venue sports, this Sony lens I think it's an amazing lens for that. And I think that it would be fantastic in that setting. I think that it really can become the most desirable lens that's out there for that setting. And I think it's got a lot of advantages over a 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8. And so I think it's well worth considering on that front. As probably an event lens, I would also consider it as being superior. It's going to allow you to just have a brighter light intake in all of those settings. So if you're shooting in dim venues, you combine that with a superior autofocus system, and it just means that you're going to be able to work in the margins more effectively than what you can with the Tamron. And so I think in a lot of ways, the Sony is the better lens, but of course it begs the question, is it more than 2 times better? And I think the answer for some photographers will be yes. Probably for a equally, if not larger amount of photographers, the answer will be no. It actually depends on what you need out of the lens and what you plan to do with it. Both of these are very, very capable lenses, and as always, we are extremely spoiled to have such amazing options available to us at radically different price points. And so I hope that this has helped you to kind of quantify which one of these lenses maybe makes more sense for you. Now, if you want even more information, you can either check out my full reviews of both lenses, and I've got both the video and text reviews linked in the description down below, or you can stay tuned with me right now and we'll go into an optical breakdown and I'll demonstrate to you how I arrived at the conclusions I did previously. So let's dive in and let's take a look. Okay, for this comparison, or series of comparisons, I'm always going to have the Tamron on the left and the Sony on the right, so you know what you're looking at. Here, I'm going to start comparing at 50 millimeters. So at 50 millimeters, this is on 61 megapixels, A7R Mark V, and 200% magnification. You can see looking at the center of the frame, they're both extremely sharp. They both have good contrast, but the Sony has superior contrast, and you can see that the text definitely looks more crisp than what it does on the Tamron. The mid-frame, I would say there is a very slight advantage for the Sony. However, it's largely in contrast. You'll see the ink here looks inkier than what it does here. A more significant advantage is down here in the right corner, where you can see that the Sony really looks superior. That's less true up here on the left corner, however, where the Tamron looks, I would say, about equally good, and so not much of a difference there. If we pop down here, I would say that they're close. I like the Sony a little bit better, and then in the upper right corner, again, they're close, but I slightly prefer the Sony performance. If we stop both lenses down to f2.8, we can see that they both have improved, but I would say that the Sony still has an advantage in the center of the frame. In the mid-frame, I would say there's a very, very slight Sony advantage up in this corner. I look at them and they're very, very close. Hard to distinguish much of a difference between the two there, but still in this lower right corner, the Sony has the advantage. Now, if we move on to 100 millimeters, you'll see that the Tamron's already at f2.8, the Sony's still at f2, at least for this comparison. Again, they're close, but contrast favors the Sony there. And I would say, looking at the text, it's not just contrast, it's resolving at a little bit higher level. And the mid-frame, again, the Sony is giving just a little bit more detail. Look in the hair here compared to where it looks a little bit more smeared on the Tamron. They're both good, don't get me wrong, but the Sony is better. Up here in the corner, I see a Sony advantage there, higher contrast and higher detail, right out to the edge of the frame. And in the lower right corner, definitely Sony. That is a superior place. More similar on this side, though a little bit Sony advantage, and up in this corner, again, it's closer, but it's a Sony advantage here as well. Now, if we stop the Sony down to f2.8, you would expect that advantage to grow even more, and I think that it does. You can see that it looks better everywhere that we've looked so far. Up in this corner, it looks better, and down here, it was already better, and it looks much better now. Over on this side, it's a more clear advantage. So at equivalent apertures, the Sony is definitely the sharper, higher contrast lens at 100 millimeters. Now at 150 millimeters, Tamron at f2.8, Sony at f2, you can see once again that the Sony lens is sharper and higher contrast. Again, the Tamron is extremely good. This is 200% magnification, so it looks great, but the Sony is clearly demonstrably better. And here again, the margins are close, but you can just see all of that text, the fine detail here. Contrast definitely favors the Sony lens. Up in this corner, the Sony looks to be the sharper, higher contrast of the two. And down in this corner, for once, it's not a huge advantage for the Sony. It's very, very close over on this side. It's close, but I think the contrast is better on the Sony lens. And up in this corner, the same is true. You can see that just the text looks a little bit crisper there. And as before, if you stop the Sony down to f2.8, it definitely has an advantage. That contrast advantage grows, and it's also just resolving higher. You can see that that's just popping off the page, where it looks just a little dingier on the Tamron lens. Likewise, up here, looking better there, and down into this corner, looking better with better contrast, though not significantly so, but a little bit more obvious difference here. So the big question is, are you going to see that difference out in the real world? Well, the answer is complicated. At 100% magnification, which is the typical way you're going to look at things, you can see that really the detail and contrast looks really quite similar. And there's a little bit of give and take as I pan around, but they are a very, very similar performance. This is, of course, f2.8 for the Tamron lens and f2 for the Sony. I also feel like at this stage that Sony's Bokeh looks relatively good compared to the Tamron. Now, where I think that's less true is if you'll see in the Tamron in the transition towards defocus, even though it's got not as shallow a depth of field, and so this should favor the Sony, you can see in that transition towards defocus that it's handled more smoothly on the Tamron, whereas on the Sony, there's just a little bit more distracting elements that are there. Now, as you get more deeply out of focus, for example here, the advantage of having that more shallow depth of field favors the Sony, where things are just a little bit more out of focus and thus attract the eye a little bit less. And so even in this zone, I think that it looks a little bit softer on the Sony. If I move on to 150 millimeters, again, Tamron being f2.8, Sony being f2, you can see here that in the area of focus, I actually think that the Tamron has higher contrast and more detail in the real-world shot here. And if we pan around a little bit, you can see that that remains true. It's a little bit better here for the Sony. And again, as we get towards these transition areas, some of this stuff is just a little bit more distracting on the Sony as we transition towards defocus. Now, if I stop the Sony down to f2.8, you can see that now they look pretty much identical, and I don't think that there's any advantage for the Tamron any longer in the areas of texture and sharpness. And as we move towards defocus, they're just highly similar in many ways. In this shot, for example, looking at them globally, you can see that the Sony's background is more defocused at f2 versus f2.8. As far as the real-world sharpness and contrast, I do think it's a little bit higher on the Sony, but as you can see at 100% magnification, without them side by side, I don't know that you would see that difference. Now, in this comparison, the more shallow depth of field provided by the Sony, you can see globally it does have an advantage. If we look at the contrast and detail here, I think the Tamron is holding up a little bit better here, and more importantly, in the transition towards defocus here, I do feel like it's a little bit smoother on the Tamron than what it is on the Sony. Once again, however, if I stop the Sony down to f2.8, you can see that now the contrast and detail definitely matches that of the Tamron, though I still like the overall look of the Tamron's transition zone to defocus, and that's where I think the Tamron wins, is in that transition zone. There's just more edging, more circular shapes, and so you can see that the background area, it looks busier on the Sony relative to the Tamron, which transitions to a nicer defocus. Now, looking at the images globally, I don't know that you see that as much. I mean, you can jump in here and look at that, and a lot of this is just out of focus, and so it's hard to determine too much from that. Here's another good example overall, and so again, looking at the image globally, you can tell that the background is more defocused from the Sony. Looking at the contrast and the detail on the subject, They both look good. Is the Sony better? It very likely is slightly better, but you can tell when you get into these real-world images and away from the test chart, it's a little bit harder to read. But where, again, the Tamron I prefer is in these transition zones. As you move towards the defocus, if you look in this area here, the Sony is kind of busy, whereas you get more of just that kind of glow, creamy background on the Tamron as it moves towards defocus. Now, when you get, seriously defocused, I don't know that there's much of a difference there. It's more in that kind of transition area where the Tamron just is a little bit smoother than what the Sony is, even though the Sony has the advantage of the more shallow depth of field. If I swap to the f2.8 version of the image, it gives the Sony more contrast and detail. I'm not sure that was needed all that much, but what it also does is you can see that at apples to apples, f2.8 to f2.8, that transition zone is definitely smoother on the Tamron lens. And now, of course, the Sony doesn't have the advantage of having a more defocused background. And so I think that some of these things just become a little bit more obvious, a little busier looking on the Sony versus the Tamron lens. And it's really that transition zone above all. So how about for a portrait shot? And so here, looking at the overall backgrounds, obviously the Sony is more defocused at f2, then look tremendously different in this kind of setting. As we've seen previously, when it's f2.8 versus f2, I do feel like the Tamron often shows just a little bit more contrast and detail. Part of that has to do with the fact that the depth of field is very, very shallow on the Sony lens. If I swap to the f2.8 shot, you can see that now the contrast, I would say, in detail favors the Sony lens. And if we look at the background, again, in this case, I don't think that it's really all that radically different. You're probably not going to see much of a difference. Just kind of looking at what's defocused here, they look more similar than different, I would say. Now, finally, on the note of magnification, you can see that there is very slightly higher magnification for the Sony image here. However, it's not radically different. Neither one of these is going to fill the frame, even with this medium-sized lens. So don't mistake them for macro lenses. Probably more significant if you buy either one of these lenses, that you can see that there is slightly higher magnification here on the GM lens on the 50mm versus the 150mm end. But you can see that there's a little bit of a perspective distortion just for being so close here at 50mm, whereas you've got a flatter plane of focus at 150mm and a more compressed, blurred out background, even though the magnification is lower. So in some ways, I kind of favor this than getting here where I feel like it feels a little bit stretched and distorted. So as you can see, these are very different lenses, and there are certain similarities and other areas where they're not similar at all. And hopefully the optical breakdown has helped you to decide which one is the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.